Hello, welcome to Foreign Entanglements. I'm Matt Duss. I'm an analyst at the Center for American Progress and a columnist for the American Prospect magazine. With me is Ben Birnbaum. Ben is a freelance journalist who's been living in Israel for the past year and a contributor to the New Republic, among other magazines. Welcome, Ben. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing, Matt?
I'm pretty good. So you've done some really interesting pieces on on Israel and Palestine, the state of the two-state solution. But before that, I just want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about a trip you took to North Korea recently. What was that like?
It was very creepy, just as I would expect. Basically, I went on one of these guided tours that you can go on. So you basically go on the North Korean version of Birthright. You know, they take you around the country. They show you everything what they want to show you. You know, I had a great time, so I'm not complaining. And we went actually at a very tense time. We went at the beginning of April, just as everything was blowing up. So, you know, I was a little scared because even though I wasn't going as a journalist, I was worried they would find out I was a journalist. But everything turned out great. And, you know, I definitely learned a lot that I would never have learned from a book. And, you know, if anyone is interested in going, you can check out howtogotonorthkorea.com, and they have, pretty reasonable trips that you can go on for a week. So
what was one or two things that kind of blew your mind about the trip that you hadn't expected?
Yeah, I think in general it was the dichotomy between Pyongyang and how actually quite developed the capital was. You know, everything was well paved. They have tall buildings, and they have things that you wouldn't really expect to be in North Korea. You know, we went bowling at the Pyongyang Golden Lane Bowling Alley. They had like American arcade games. So if you're part of the privileged class who can live in Pyongyang, you know, things could be worse. But then, like, the moment you get outside the capital, and this is clearest in the condition of the streets, all of a sudden you're back in the third world. And you feel like you're in, 1950s China.
Yeah.
So, our tour bus just bounced up and down because, there are really no paved highways outside of the capital, at least that I'm aware of.
So I know, one of my favorite, it's not a great story, it's a horrible story, but one of my favorite stories about, North Korea has to do with, was this Kim Jong-il or his father? I think it was Kim Jong-il who had this Japanese director kidnapped so he could make his own Godzilla movie, Pulgasari. Which, if people haven't seen Pulgasari, it's awful and you should watch it immediately. But because he was such a huge fan, he was a huge fan of these kinds of movies. So I guess this bowling alley makes me think of maybe Kim Jong-un will be kidnapping Jeff Bridges. To reenact The Big Lebowski.
Yeah, exactly.
Because Kim Jong-un has obviously always wanted to play the John Goodman role, so he'll force Jeff Bridges to reenact the entire movie with him.
Yeah, actually, some interesting things. I was really surprised we didn't see. Obviously, the first thing you notice in North Korea is just how much propaganda there is everywhere. It's just murals of Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung. You have these sort of banners with text, and I don't know what all of them said. I would ask our tour guides to translate for us. Let us worship Kim Jong-il, let us, follow his instructions. You don't see anything about Kim Jong-un yet, at least not pictures. I saw nothing in the entire country, and everyone wears a red pin of either Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il, but nothing from Kim Jong-un yet, so
he's probably going to start, getting his stuff in there slowly and gradually.
Yeah, that probably.
Yeah. Okay, did you publish anything on that? Well, you said you didn't go as a journalist, but did you publish anything afterward?
Not yet. I probably will be. It's still in the works, but stay tuned. I'm probably going to be publishing something in the next few months.
Okay, we'll look for that.
Yeah.
So moving to the Middle East, you published a very good cover article in the New Republic back in March, I think it was, on the two-state solution, how this is possibly the last opportunity we have to achieve that goal, 2 states for 2 people.
Yeah.
I think it was. I enjoyed it a lot. It was a very deeply reported and detailed piece. I mean, I think I told you this privately, but I'll just say it here now. I mean, we both know that this is an issue full of landmines.
Yeah.
Every use of terminology, you're going to make someone angry, and
Yeah.
of course, there were critics of your piece. As there, if you write about Israel Palestine and people don't criticize it, you have to question whether you're saying anything worthwhile. But I think the piece did a very good job of managing those, of kind of navigating that and saying something valuable. Why don't you go ahead and just set up the piece? And I think you had a follow-up piece a couple weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
And just how does that relate to where we are right now with what Secretary Kerry is up to?
Yeah. I think the central argument of the piece is basically that it's not too late for a two-state solution, but that it probably will be in a couple years based on a number of factors. You sort of have this perfect storm of events that's brewing, and so I feel like we, when maybe we write the book about the death of the two-state solution 20 years from now, we might look back at this period as the critical period. I think Yuval Diskin, who is the former chief of the Shin Bet, he was one of the 6 guys in the Gatekeepers. He just wrote a good op-ed for the Jerusalem Post where he described us approaching the point of no return. And, the point of no return could be a few things. It could be the fact that you will no longer have a Palestinian leadership in the West Bank that would be prepared to make the compromises that would be necessary for a deal. It could be the fact that the settlement enterprise, which, even though it would be extremely difficult to extricate 100,000 or however many settlers you would need to from the West Bank, it's still doable. I am of the belief that if Benjamin Netanyahu decided tomorrow that he wanted to make the compromises necessary for peace, he could have the political capital necessary to do that. And he's probably the only one. That's the thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a question a number of people have asked here in D.C. A, does he really want it? And B, would it be politically sustainable for him?
Yeah.
I mean, does not only does he have the capital, but does he have the votes? I mean, could he assemble a coalition that would support this? It seems to me that he does.
Yeah.
Do you agree?
He absolutely does. I mean, right now what you're seeing with the talks about Kerry restarting the talks, potentially on the basis of the 67 lines with, some wiggle room and deniability for both sides. Mm-hmm. Right. But right now, Naftali Bennett with his party, they have 12 seats. He's threatening to leave the coalition. And he technically could bring down the government. But fortunately for Netanyahu, Sheli Yochimovich, the leader of the Labour Party, which has 15 seats, has offered to be Netanyahu's safety net if it was necessary for peace. So I think it's very possible that in the coming weeks you will see Bennett leave the coalition and Labour come in instead. And then you'd still have a coalition of some 70 MKs that would be very stable and that would definitely be able to approve a deal. The bigger the bigger question is Netanyahu's problems within the Likud. But I think this is probably going to be his last term, so we'll see.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think, the Likud issue, I mean, he's basically the most moderate person in the Likud party right now. You think that's correct?
Among the ministers, definitely, yeah.
Yeah. So what, I mean, say Bennett does leave the coalition, I mean, what does this do? How does Lapid react? How does Yesh Atid react? Because they've had a partnership up until now.
Yeah. I mean, I think that was a partnership of convenience. Lapid is very much for the two-state solution, even though, interestingly enough, he has the same position as Netanyahu on Jerusalem, which is he's against any division. So, but I don't think he speaks for the people in his party. I think most of the people in his party are prepared to sign on to the compromises that you would need on the Israeli side for a deal. Right. And I think Lapid is a pragmatic guy. He's not a religious guy. I think if the deal was on the table, he would be there.
Right. I mean, the presence of Jacob Perry in the party, Jacob Perry, the former Shin Bet head, also appearing in the Gatekeepers, and who, as I understand it, is essentially, the head, who is like one of the main drafter of the foreign policy national security platform of Yesh Atid.
Yeah.
and one of the key proponents of the Israeli Peace Initiative, which was a response to or a call on the Israeli government to respond fully to the Arab Peace Initiative.
Yeah.
Definitely, I think just affirms what you just said, that there are definitely voices inside that party that would support, being part of a peace negotiation and an agreement.
Yeah. And more importantly, the public opinion is there. Every poll that's been done on this subject shows that on the one hand, Israelis are very skeptical, much more skeptical than they were, before the Intifada, that a deal can be reached. But at the same time, the compromises that they're willing to make for peace are way to the left of where they were in the 90s. This is sort of, I think, the untold story of the peace process, is the fact that by any objective measure, Benjamin Netanyahu today is to the left of where Yitzhak Rabin was in the 90s. It's indisputable. So...
Yeah, in terms... draw that out for a little bit.
Sure. Basically, what is defined as... what was defined as a far-left idea in the 90s is now considered very mainstream. For example, there was this report in Haaretz a few weeks ago quoting a senior Likud cabinet minister saying that Netanyahu was prepared for a deal to withdraw from more than 90% of the West Bank. Now, let's forget for a second that that would not be enough for the Palestinians for a deal because, as you and I both know, if there's going to be a deal that's going to be accepted by both sides, it's going to entail 100% with, give or take, 4% in land swaps to accommodate some settlements. But that's an extraordinary thing that a Likud prime minister would be willing to withdraw from more than 90% of the West Bank. And in this last piece that I wrote for The New Republic, I quoted Aaron David Miller and his book, his really good book, The Much Too Promised Land. He was talking about his reaction in 2000 when he first found out that Ehud Barak was considering 80% withdrawal from the West Bank, and he was shocked, he was impressed, because no Israeli prime minister had ever thought of anything even close to that. So, I am cautiously optimistic. I don't think there's peace on the horizon, but I also don't think that these peace talks are doomed from the start. Yeah,
I agree with that. I think I've actually been doing some work looking, kind of in detail at the efforts that Kerry has been teeing up, and, he's wisely, I think, been keeping the details of these things pretty close. But you can see the broad outlines of a multifaceted effort to not only create a more conducive environment for talks, but also to have projects ready to go in the event that those talks do make progress.
Yeah.
But I think, as of right now, and we're speaking, in Washington time, it's 10 a.m. in the morning, and as I last saw right before we started this, Kerry had flown to Ramallah to have talks with Abbas. Again, the Fatah Central Committee met yesterday and decided to delay an announcement of whether they would re-enter talks. There's apparently a hang-up on that line about the 67 lines.
Yeah.
Which, all things considered, you want to say, all right, well, why not just come to talks and put the onus on Netanyahu and see what's achieved? But I think, especially here in the States, it's often underestimated how politically costly it is for Abbas to come back to the table and achieve nothing.
Yeah.
And I think we do a very, very good job here in the U.S., taking into account the various political realities of Israeli politicians.
Yeah.
We do a much less good job with regard to the political realities for the Palestinian leadership. But I think this, the 67 lines, obviously there was a big blow-up between the U.S. and Israel over this in 2011 when President Obama included this in his speech at the State Department. What's your take on that? Why? It seems to me that we are talking about something around which there's a fairly clear international consensus. No one, I repeat, no one is saying that Israel has to retreat to the 67 lines.
Yeah.
There's an understanding that we're merely talking about a frame of reference, that basically both sides are sort of agreeing on how many poker chips they have before they start playing.
Yeah.
Does that sound right?
Yeah, I agree with you. I can see both sides of this argument. On the one hand, I do agree that any deal is going to be based on the 67 lines and that it's almost pointless to enter into negotiations. I think from the Palestinian perspective, they feel like this is all very pointless if things are not going to pick up around where they left off under Olmert. At the same time, I think it's a little unfair to expect Netanyahu to make all of the Israeli compromises up front and not to expect something parallel on the Palestinian side. And that's what I think you're seeing with Kerry, is he's trying to do something with this whole issue of Jewish state recognition or recognition of Jewish connection. And I think that's probably the way to go. And I don't know whether they're going to accept that, but I think the question for the Palestinian leadership is, what is the alternative? You're going to go back to the UN to gain what? Gain, representation in a few more committees. And I think it would be foolish not to test Netanyahu, because as I wrote in this last piece, peace talks have a way of pushing prime ministers into concessions that are more far-reaching than they wanted to at the start. It's just the momentum is that way, and particularly if you swap out Bennett from the coalition and you have a coalition with Labour and with Livni and with Lapid, I think it's worth a try.
Right. Yeah, I agree. I mean, everything what I said about, the costs I think are clear for Abbas, the risks here. But it seems to me that, at this point you really need to test Netanyahu. I've tried to figure this out, talking to people in who are close to Abbas, but it's still, the basic. As for the idea that you're asking for concessions up front, I don't think that's quite right. I think the Palestinians, they've agreed, okay, we will put a hold on our efforts to, even though I think the actual benefit of the UN strategy is arguable. In fact, I wrote this, and I spoke to a number of Palestinian leaders when I was there in March, and the fairly strong consensus is that the costs just completely outweighed the benefits.
Yeah.
For the UN strategy. But it seems to me that if on the one hand you're asking the Palestinians to stop that strategy, which, agree or disagree with it, a tactical maneuver, it is the Palestinians trying to achieve multilateral recognition, achieving what everyone agrees are their basic national rights in multilateral international fora. Whereas on the other hand, you're asking the Israelis to slow settlement building.
Yeah.
And those are just, not equivalent concessions by any stretch of the imagination.
They're not equivalent in what you think the Palestinians...
Well, on the one hand, you're asking the Palestinians to not pursue what everyone agrees are their rights. On the other hand, you're asking the Israelis to stop doing what the entire world recognizes is illegal.
Okay.
You understand what I'm saying?
I do understand what you're saying, but this is...
As a political matter... Go ahead, sorry.
No, I generally don't like to get into these issues of international law and what is morally right. I'm more of a pragmatist on these issues, and that's I don't like to litigate the past and litigate international law, because it always goes nowhere. I just think from a practical standpoint, like you said, they really don't have a whole lot to lose, and they have potentially everything to gain, because Netanyahu is the prime minister who could see a deal through. Whatever you think of Olmert, when he made his offer in 2008, he really didn't have the political capital to see it through. So, and let's say tomorrow there was an election, and by some miracle, Shelley Yachimowicz and Labour formed the government. Do you really think Shelley Yachimowicz could push a deal through and could evacuate 120,000 settlers? I don't.
Right.
So, it's all about the alternatives.
Right. That's a great point. Just on stepping back for a moment on your point about litigating these questions, I think you want to avoid just getting into a blame game, but I think the point I was raising, it goes to what I was saying earlier about how these efforts are viewed by the Palestinian public and the political costs that they incur for Palestinian leadership. And I've heard this specifically from young Palestinian activists. It's like what Palestinians are being asked to abstain from, what they're being asked to concede in exchange for what they see the Israelis as being asked to concede. That makes that raises political costs for the Palestinian leadership, because the Palestinian public just sees these, quote unquote concessions as just so wildly out of step with each other.
Yeah, I don't doubt it, and I'm sensitive to that. So, we'll see. I seems like there have been some holdups, and but I don't know. I guess time will tell. I think Kerry very wisely has been keeping expectations low.
Yeah.
And I don't think anyone has expected him to succeed. So the fact that we're this close is encouraging.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think Hussein Ibish wrote a very good piece today in Foreign Policy, pushing back on the idea that Kerry's just wasting his time.
Yeah.
I'm just personally, I'm extremely bored with these sorts of articles that say, why is Kerry wasting his time?
Right.
Well, there's all stuff going on in the Middle East. Well,
exactly.
Okay.
And here's the other point that I want to make about Netanyahu is, let's say worst case scenario, Abbas does enter talks and they don't reach a deal, which they probably won't, let's face it. But if you can get Benjamin Netanyahu on the record supporting 90% plus withdrawal from the West Bank, that's a huge achievement, because that basically moves the goalposts for future discussions about this in Israel. I mean, whatever you say about the Barak and Olmert offers, I think what they did accomplish is they sort of, they served to move what was a radical idea in the 90s well into the Israeli mainstream.
Yeah.
And to get a Likud prime minister on the record supporting basically near complete withdrawal from the West Bank, that's a huge blow to the greater Israel camp. And, basically it signals to people who supported Netanyahu and who maybe consider themselves right-wingers that this is kosher. This is kosher to support something like that. And that's really big.
So let's move a few hundred miles the other direction in the Middle East and look at the Iran issue. Prime Minister Netanyahu was on Face the Nation last Sunday, kind of restarting his efforts to make put the Iran issue back front and center for Americans.
Yeah.
Putting pressure on the U.S. government to be a bit more verbose in its threats, or just talking about the military option, however you want to phrase it. What do you think's driving this for Netanyahu?
It's, the same thing that's been driving it for him for 3 years. And his problem, as you know, is that he's been up to this game for 4 years now. This is the 4th year where Netanyahu signals to the world that, I might strike, and so he tries to sort of raise the temperature, and in order to goad the world into imposing sanctions and taking this issue seriously. And every moment at the last minute, he's stepped back and there hasn't been a strike. So I think it's created this false sense that it's never going to come. But I don't think that, and especially now with the election of Rouhani, which I'd be curious about your thoughts about that. I think there's this sense that the Israeli military option has been put off a year. And I'm going to be writing about this in the next week. I met with a very senior former Israeli security figure who believes that Israel might not have another year for its military option. And there are a few issues here. There's the issue of the breakup period and the fact that the more centrifuges they have, the smaller it gets. And I think the common estimate now is it's down to a few months. And, not too long ago it was at a year. So basically, if Iran decided tomorrow that it wanted to go for a bomb, it would take them a few months to do it. But if they were to sneak out, even Israel's intelligence apparatus might find out too late. And if they add even more centrifuges, in a few months it could be a few weeks. And it's getting very uncomfortable for the Israelis. And the other thing is the military option itself. It's, as this person was telling me, there's this assumption that the Israeli military option, has only gotten worse, and that's not necessarily the case. That they've gotten capabilities that they didn't necessarily have 5 years ago. But that's not going to be the case forever, and especially if Iran starts moving their sights underground and taking other protective measures, there's going to become a point where they won't have as much confidence that a strike could do sufficient damage to be worth the costs and rockets and political costs. And what this person was telling me was basically that it's not a binary thing. It's not that you have a military option one day and then it disappears the next. But you do sort of have you have shades and it fades away. So let's say you have 95% confidence today that a strike would accomplish its objectives. It would set back the program 3 or 4 years. Maybe tomorrow that's 90%, and then maybe in a few months it's 80%.
Interesting. I mean, obviously, we'll see. I mean, I've been a huge skeptic that it would ever happen for quite some time.
Really? Why is that?
Yeah. I just, for the reasons you said, I think that the costs of a unilateral Israeli strike outweigh the benefits in so many ways. I mean, first of all, it at the very best, if we're talking about the most successful possible strike, that we're talking about delaying, not ending the program.
Right.
And in which case Iran then surfs a wave of international outrage, withdraws from the NPT, and we're back in a containment situation very, very quickly.
But is that necessary? I mean, let me just challenge that assumption for a second. I mean, first of all, this idea of setting back the program, as this person was telling me, and this is absolutely true, by definition, you can't set back a nuclear program more than 4 or 5 years, because any advanced country that has the technical knowledge to build a bomb can make a nuclear bomb in 4 to 5 years. So this idea that, they can only set it back for 4 years, that's sort of silly. And, I mean, the same thing was true of the OSIREC. People said, maybe it's just going to set back the program a few years. But the delay became permanent because the costs for Saddam Hussein to reconstitute the program, it wasn't in his interest. And
it didn't become permanent. I mean, the only reason, he recommitted to the program, he reconstituted, he was on his way to doing it. It's only because he was so stupid to invade Kuwait.
Yeah, actually, you know what? I got my history wrong there. You're right. Yeah. I'm sorry. Brain fart. Okay. But I'm saying, like, I just don't see that, the sanctions regime would crumble if they destroy the program tomorrow. I think there would be an interest, after you set the precedent of Israeli military action, people, and all of the chaos that it would unleash, I think people would try to avoid a repeat scenario.
I think that's right, but I mean, as to the question, as to the point about, delay is, by definition what you're going to do. I think that goes to my larger point, which is, like, you don't deal with this militarily.
Okay, but what? So how do you deal with it?
You do. I mean, the only way we're going to conceive, to deal with the problem in a way that is, semi-permanent, that does not require, continued military action. Because, I mean, once you strike, whether it's Israel or the United States, you are in a situation where I think you basically just have to keep, I hate this term, but this is what it is, mowing the lawn.
Yeah.
To make sure that the program is not reconstituted. So addressing the political aspects of it, addressing the political decision, changing Iran's mind about obtaining a nuclear weapon is where the focus has to remain. I mean, that's the only way we deal with this, I think, responsibly and in a semi-permanent way.
I mean, I think everyone agrees with you. I think Benjamin Netanyahu agrees with you. The question is, how much time do we give negotiations, and how much time do we have? And, the worry here in Israel is that Rouhani, he's going to, be smiling, and he's going to give, a nice face to the Iranian nuclear program, and he's going to play for time to the point where they will be able to break out in a few weeks. And there's nothing that anyone, not Israel or the U.S., is going to be able to do about it. So, I definitely hope it can be resolved diplomatically, but I would not bet on it.
I mean, one thing that really, this debate over whether Iran behaves in a rational manner is one that was ongoing in Israel after comments by a former Mossad head, Meir Dagan, who said in various ways, Iran is rational. It's a question of how, but you have to define that term. I mean, what does it mean to be rational versus irrational? What are your goals? What are your values? And what will you sacrifice to achieve those goals and serve those values? But I think one thing that bothered me about Netanyahu's appearance on Face the Nation was this repeated assertion that Iran is this apocalyptic messianic regime. Which, certainly, I mean, this government has been engaged in horrible things, supporting terrorism. Its leaders are anti-Israel and say anti-Semitic things. There's more than enough to disturb people about what Iran has been up to and what its leaders have said without introducing what I think are clearly false claims about this government's desire to trigger the apocalypse. Sure. I mean, that's the sort of thing that seems to me really, doesn't contribute to a good policy discussion or a good policy outcome.
Sure. But the question is, are you 100% sure of that? Are you 100% sure that I tend to believe that if they got the bomb, they wouldn't unleash World War III. They wouldn't strike Israel. But I'm not 100% confident about that, and I don't think anyone can be. And if the costs are basically, even if there is a 2% chance or a 3% chance that they would use a nuclear weapon sometime in the next 10 years, that's sort of an intolerable risk for Israel compared to the more limited costs of a military operation. So, look, all I can say is that the debate within Israel has never been, among the Israeli security establishment, the debate has never been between those who think that Israel should bomb the facilities or not bomb the facilities, or live with the bomb or not live with the bomb. Pretty much everyone agrees that if it came to the fork in the road, Israel should launch a military operation. The only question is, when is too late? When is the window of opportunity over? So,
then there's like the flip side of that question, which is understanding that once Israel does decide to strike, that essentially short circuits the diplomatic track.
And this is the problem, because Rouhani isn't taking office until August, and it doesn't necessarily become impossible in the winter, but it becomes a lot more complicated because of the clear skies issues. So you might be looking at a very limited window of opportunity to show some diplomatic progress.
So getting to Rouhani, and yes, Rouhani's reputation as a more pragmatic leader certainly has Netanyahu and other hawks concerned. The idea that he would just smile and appear reasonable, while, continuing the work. I think we saw this in a debate in a hearing yesterday in the Senate with Lindsey Graham challenging, I think it was General Dempsey, on the question of whether Rouhani was a moderate.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of a silly debate. It's not a word I use. He was, I think, the most moderate choice for the presidential candidates. That's not saying much, given all actual reformers and we're kind of vetted out. But sure, moderate is a very relative term. But I think pragmatic is probably is probably a better way to look at it.
Do we throw the Jews into the sea, or do we nudge them into the sea?
That's not far off. He's not said. I think that might be a bit of an overstatement, but he's not been just the wildly, ridiculous and offensive, rhetorical clown that Ahmadinejad was.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of a disappointment. I've heard this specifically from some hawks here and in Israel.
Yeah.
Ahmadinejad made things easy.
He did.
In a way, for Netanyahu and others who just because he was such a character and said these completely ridiculous things, totally indefensible, where the fear here is that Rouhani thinks those things, but is smart enough not to say them.
Yeah. What's your take on Rouhani's approach? Do you think, and does he have the power? At the end of the day, does he really have the power to give any concessions that, Khamenei will not approve?
It's a great question. It goes back to what one thinks was the thinking or the planning that took place around Rouhani's victory. We saw in 2009 that Khamenei, the people voted once again for the most moderate candidate in 2009, but for various reasons, Khamenei decided that his guy Ahmadinejad needed to win that election and intervened in what I think was an uncharacteristically heavy-handed way, and experienced a lot of costs for that heavy-handed intervention. So for some reason, people have various theories why this happened. They decided to let Rouhani win, or let the votes stand, the actual, count the actual votes as they were. I think that goes to the fact, they recognize that that the cost in political legitimacy, such as it is. Yeah. But I think this, it goes to the fact that, yes, Iran, even though it is an authoritarian society, even though it is a police state in a lot of ways, there is some measure of political legitimacy that matters to the regime. They have a baseline level of legitimacy that they feel that they need to cultivate and that they lost in 2009. Now, what this means about Rouhani's freedom to maneuver, I don't know. I mean, we'll really have to see. I mean, we have to wait and see until negotiations start up again, what kind of deals are on the table and what Rouhani is able to support and actually sell within, that inner circle around Khamenei.
I was actually surprised, and I think this is one reason why his victory caught everyone by surprise, that the people who voted for Mousavi in 2009 actually came out and voted. I sort of expected they were going to stay home. So do you have any insight about, domestic Iranian politics? Why did they not just believe that their votes were going to be thrown out?
I mean, I think part of it has to be that, as much as many Iranians are disappointed with what the Islamic Republic has become, it seems to me that there is still a good deal of pride amongst Iranians that this is something that they established, in the face of Western support for the Shah. There's still, there is a good deal of personal and political investment in their country and its system, even if it's a system that disappoints them in a lot of ways. And frankly, I think it showed a level of political sophistication on the part of Iranian voters that they recognized that they had very, very little to gain by simply boycotting the process.
Yeah.
But still, the economy was, I think it's pretty safe to say, was the main issue. The economy is in very dire straits. I think there is a debate over how much it was. Certainly, there was some aspect, some recognition that this was a result of sanctions, and that those sanctions are in turn a result of the Ahmadinejad government's managing of the nuclear file.
Yeah.
I think some people have theorized over how much exactly international pressure meant to the election. I think it's safe to say it meant something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But what all this means, it seems clear again that there's support for Iran's right to have a nuclear program, but less clear over how much support there is for Iran. What the Iranian people, the population, would actually countenance in terms of giving up or making certain concessions.
Yeah.
And where that falls within Khamenei's, views there.
Yeah. Speaking of elections, do you want to transition over to Egypt and everything that's going on there?
You know what? Unfortunately, that's a whole other discussion that I don't really have time for today. Although it's something I would love to discuss at some time in the future. Do you have any quick thoughts on there?
Basically, I think, like everyone, I'm sort of conflicted about what the military did. On the one hand, I sort of am sympathetic to the argument that if they had waited 3 years, maybe there wouldn't have been elections, and Morsi would have continued consolidating power.
Yeah.
But I don't know. Something doesn't sit right with me about what happened, and I think it would have been really amazing if you had seen the Muslim Brotherhood voted out democratically. And I definitely am. I think the argument that this is a really big blow to what was a really positive development, which is that the rise of political Islam in the era of the Arab Spring was a good thing because it dealt a big blow to Al Qaeda. So I'm sort of worried about the blowback on that front.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I thought something very. I mean, that is one of my main concerns, and I think Shadi Hamid raised this point in the New York Times, where it's like, listen, you basically just after 2006 with Hamas, and now with the Muslim Brotherhood, you basically affirmed a lot of Al Qaeda's arguments about the futility of engaging in the democratic process.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real problem. But anyway, let's do this again soon, and we can talk more in depth on that issue. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Absolutely.
And again, look forward to your pieces coming up.
Thanks a lot, Matt.
All right, thanks a lot.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.